Test, test. Okay, not started. So, we are still waiting for Pak Bambang, our Minister of Planning, head of Bappenas. He is on the way. He's just coming from Hotel Mandarin. If there is no traffic, usually no traffic, it will take about 15 minutes. So we'll be slightly late. Uh, we are also still waiting for other people to come. Selamat pagi Pak Menteri. Good morning everyone. Welcome to SMERU. We are very grateful to have you all here despite your very busy schedule. So I would like to begin this workshop or discussion by thanking all of our speakers for entrusting SMERU to host this very interesting topic on building a better IMF, lesson from independent evaluation of the IMF performance. And I would like also to thank you all, the audience, for being here. I'm Sudarno Sumarto from the SMERU Research Institute, Senior Research Fellow, but also the Policy Advisor at the National Team on the Acceleration of Poverty Reduction, Office of the Vice President. Last September, I met Charles in Hangzhou, China, at the ASEAN Economic Evaluation Workshop, where Charles and I believe Ling Huitan presented their evaluation on the role of IMF on the social protection, where I was one of the discussion. At that time, he approached me if he was interested in holding a workshop at Bambang on done by independent institute like SMERU and NGO, but what IMF has been up to, has they adapted on the new challenge of development, and how has IMF engaged with social policy and things like that. And I suggested probably SMERU can be a good place to host such seminar. So that's why we are here today, to listen from Charles, and also he is the Independent Evaluation Office. He is the director, and also Prakash, advisor of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. So it is my great honor for both of you to come here and present your evaluation, your work on this impact evaluation of the IMF over the last 15 years. So in the next 40 minutes, probably you will be presenting the lesson from independent evaluation, and then we will have Professor Bambang Brojo, our planning minister, head of Bappenas, who will give remark on the IEO and also talk about the recent development of Indonesian policies and also social protection. Last but not least, Pak Max from Indonesian Science Institute of Science, LIPI, will give a discussion on the IMF evaluation of the last 20-something years, 27th completed report of the IEO. And one of the benefits of moderating the famous people is that everybody already memorized their background, their CV, where they go to school, education. He went to Oxford, he went to Illinois, and he went to BIA. So I don't need to make an introduction. So without further ado, I would like to invite Prakash first, or Charles first, and then we'll continue with Pak Bambang and also Pak Max. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Charles.
Thanks so much, Darno. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for joining us. Particular thanks to the Minister for being with us today, and thanks to SMERU for hosting. Is this? Can you all hear me at the back? Is this working well? Okay, excellent. So we're here to discuss the role of independent evaluation in helping to build a better IMF, helping the fund to achieve its mandate more effectively. We were started in 2001, just after the Asia crisis, which was not just a crisis in the region, it was also in fact a crisis for the IMF, a crisis of the legitimacy and credibility of the IMF. So I was talking to SMERU colleagues this morning, and I realized that actually SMERU and the IEO are both children of the crisis. We both started about the same time in response to some of the concerns that the crisis raised. I think the IEO has been quite successful over the past 16 years. It's really established itself as a core pillar of governance, of good governance at the IMF. As we'll be discussing, I think the IEO has made an important contribution to improving the accountability of the IMF, to helping the fund to learn from its own experience about how to do better in the future, and also it's contributed towards opening up the IMF, making it more transparent, more credible institution. So I really do think that the IEO has helped to build a better IMF over the past 16 years. In our presentation, I'll first hand over to Prakash, who will talk a bit about the broader challenges that the fund has faced over the past couple of decades, and give a broad picture of how the fund has adapted to these challenges. And then I'll come back and talk more specifically about the IO itself, how we're structured, how do we go about our evaluations, and I'll talk a little bit in more detail about the particular case study that we did on the IMF and social protection, which I think is particularly interesting to this group. And then we look forward to hearing from the Minister and Dr. Max their perspectives, and then hopefully we'll have a chance for some discussion as well. So let me pass over to Prakash.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles, and thanks to SMERU for giving us this opportunity to tell you a bit about the IEO and the changes at the IMF. So I'll talk about some of the challenges the institution has faced. Generally you hear about the IMF when there is a crisis, and there have been many crises that the IMF has had to face since its creation. These are some of the ones in the last 30-40 years. Of course, the most famous is the Asia crisis in 1997. Okay. So one way to tell the story of the IMF is that it has faced many crises and it has tried to learn from these crises. Okay. But you can also tell a broader story of many changes going on in the world economy which have forced the IMF to adapt. So when the Soviet Union fell, it led to a kind of discrediting of central planning as a way of organizing the economy, and it led to many changes. Many more countries became part of the global trading system. Many countries opened their capital accounts, leading to massive capital flows. And to deal with these changes, countries had to move towards more exchange rate variability. So the IMF, as you may know, was set up at a time when capital accounts were closed. So capital could not flow freely across countries. And it was also set up at a time when there was the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. But the IMF over time has had to deal with a very different world. So instead of having closed capital accounts, we now have great mobility of capital across countries. Instead of fixed exchange rates, more and more we have exchange rate flexibility, including in this country, for instance. So from going from a world where there were two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, the IMF has had to deal with a world in which there are many powers now, particularly here in Asia. The European Union has expanded, bringing in Eastern Europe and the Baltics also into the kind of global capitalist system. So these are some of the changes that the IMF has had to deal with, and it has had to change in response to this. So just yesterday we were talking at the conference about how the IMF has changed in response, particularly to the Asian crisis. It has gone from a world of this to a world of being a little more humble and listening much more to voices, particularly in this region. So, that has been one force for change, the crises and the criticism that the IMF has faced from outside. But there have been other challenges that are leading to rethinking at the IMF. As you may know, in the advanced economies growth has not been particularly good, leading to what is being called secular stagnation. So the advanced economies are facing aging populations, slow growth rates, falling real interest rates, which is feeding a search for yield, which including in people searching for yield in emerging markets. Okay. And another phenomenon which I and some co-authors have called secular exclusion, by which we mean this the stagnancy in median incomes in advanced economies, the rising inequality in many countries. This is within country inequality. And also in countries like sub-Saharan Africa, there has been a stalled process of income convergence. And also global challenges such as those of fragile states and climate change are not being fully met. So in short, we have moved over the last 20, 30 years towards a world which has brought in many benefits, in particular the rise of the emerging markets and the increase in incomes there has led to massive declines in poverty. So it is a world which we think is better. A globalized integrated world has given tremendous benefit, but has also posed these challenges which the IMF has had to face. So those are the challenges, and what I'm going to do next is briefly describe how the IMF has responded to these challenges. So the IMF's activities are generally classified into three groups. One is called surveillance, which is like economic monitoring. So these are like the annual reports that the IMF issues on different countries. The second part is lending. This is when the IMF gives a loan to a particular country. This is the most visible and headline grabbing part of IMF activities. And the third is capacity development or technical assistance. This is a very big part of IMF activities, nearly a third of our budget, but is not particularly headline grabbing. Okay. So I'll describe the changes in each of these three areas, but I will also describe briefly the changes that the IMF has tried to make in what we call the governance of the institution, how the institution is governed through changes in its executive board, in the quotas of different countries, and so on. So first, let's look at what it has done on surveillance, on economic monitoring. Because some of the initial crises, like the Thai crises and the Mexican tequila crisis, were brought about in part because countries were not being transparent about what they were doing. One of the first things that has happened in response to the crises has been an increase in transparency. We have been asking countries to put more and more of their data and activities on the website and make it fully available to all member countries. But in the process of asking countries for more, we realized that we ourselves as an institution had to be more transparent about what we were doing and about our policy advice. So the IMF has been putting more and more of its Article 4 consultations, its annual reports on the web, and they are now freely available for people to see what the IMF has been recommending. Okay. The other thing that the IMF has done is that because it was faced with many crises which it had failed to predict, there has been an increased attempt at trying to improve the forecastability of the IMF, of doing more analysis of risk and vulnerability, as well as looking at what are the impacts of a crisis in one country on other countries. Because sometimes the source of the crisis was one country which was a completely innocent bystander being faced with effects from other countries. So it has improved what is called the spillover analysis. Okay. And the other thing that the IMF has done, because it has now moved to a world of greater exchange rate variability, the IMF has greatly bolstered its work on the external sector. So the IMF now issues a report that's called the External Sector Report, which gets a lot of attention, which talks about whether exchange rates are overvalued or undervalued, and whether current account balances are in line with norms or deviate from it. Okay. And as the world has become connected through capital flows, the importance of the financial sector has increased greatly, leading the IMF to greatly expand its work on the financial sector. Okay. And the other thing that has happened slowly over the last 2 decades, and particularly under our present managing director, Christine Lagarde, is that the IMF has moved towards a paradigm that you might call inclusive growth. So from an exclusive focus on growth, the IMF has moved towards talking more about labor market issues and whether people have jobs, It has talked much more about inequality in incomes than it did in the past, trying to talk about gender issues. Labor force participation of women has become a very big deal at the IMF these days, and so has talk about climate change. So at the IMF these days, there are different groups that focus on each of these topics, on inequality, on gender, on climate change. And on labor markets, I used to head a group called Jobs and Growth, which was devoted to trying to improve the discussion of labor markets. Okay. So I think this is how the IMF has tried to improve its economic monitoring and its policy advice. On lending, the IMF is now a much bigger IMF in terms of its ability to lend, perhaps not as big as needed given the size of financial markets, but nevertheless, the IMF has tripled its lending capacity. This has allowed it to make some very big loans, for instance, to Greece and to Korea during the Asian crisis. The IMF on its lending side is working much more with regional partners, such as with the European Commission and the ECB, the so-called Troika, during the present crisis. The IMF has tried to introduce many insurance facilities so as to provide a line of credit for countries that are facing the effects of shocks from other countries. It introduced a new facility called FCL, Flexible Credit Line, which was used during the recent crisis by Mexico, Poland, and Colombia. Okay. And it has, to help countries in sub-Saharan Africa particularly, tried to rally new sources for concessional financing and to support countries that are hit by natural disasters. And on capacity building, the IMF has tried to enlist external donors. It has tried to go more into the field by setting up regional technical assistance centers, and it has improved its TA on financial matters. Okay. And finally, I will conclude with what the IMF has done to improve how it is governed, sort of the overarching structure of the IMF. Over time, there has been a shift in the quotas, which is the capital contributions that members make to the IMF, from the advanced economies, particularly from Europe, towards a bigger quota for China, India, and other emerging markets. Okay. And it used to be that the IMF was very close to the G7 in terms of kind of governmental body from which it consulted frequently. But during the present crisis, the IMF was consulting much more with the G20, which includes many emerging markets. So in that sense, the IMF has tried to recognize the growing role of emerging markets in the global economy and has tried to make some adjustments to giving them a bigger place in the institution. And then last, but to our mind certainly not least, the IMF has tried to become an institution that continually tries to learn from its activities and its mistakes by setting up the Independent Evaluation Office. As Charles said, this was an office set up in the aftermath of the Asian crisis, and we think that it has done very good work. Both Charles and I are relatively new to the institution, so we are not praising ourselves. We are mostly praising the work of our predecessors. So that gives you what the IMF has tried to do, but every institution tends to be very generous to its own efforts. Self-assessment is never going to be extremely critical. So I think it's good that there is an independent evaluation office, and what Charles is going to do is to tell you how well has the IMF been able to make these changes.
Well, thanks very much, Prakash. So, as I mentioned, the IO was established in 2001 after the crisis of the IMF's own legitimacy and credibility that was followed the aftermath of the Asia crisis. It was realized that it wasn't enough for the fund to do self-assessment, as Prakash mentioned. It was also realized that it wasn't enough just to do periodic external evaluations, which the fund had done over the years, but it needed a professional team that was able to do evidence-based, balanced evaluations of fund activity. So the IEO was set up in 2001. It's an independent office at the fund. It's not part of the regular staff of the IMF. We report to the executive board rather than to IMF management. And we have three interrelated objectives as laid out in our terms of reference. First, to support the executive board in its oversight over IMF activities, to improve the accountability of the fund. And frankly, the executive board, it's a resident board, and it's flooded with paper week in, week out, and just fulfilling its daily activities is overwhelming. So it's useful to the board to have a group that steps back and takes a broader look at what the IMF is doing and brings to the board assessments and recommendations independent from management and staff. It's also very important, I think, for fund management and staff to have a group like the IEO helping them to learn from their experience by providing frank, careful, balanced assessments of what they're doing. The fund is a place that has often been criticized for being overly reliant on insider views, doesn't listen enough to the rest of the world. It's been criticized for having too deep silos. Even within the institution, people don't really talk to each other. So the IEO can really help the fund's learning culture. And then thirdly, the IEO is a way of opening up the fund, making it more transparent. I think our reports, they certainly aim to explain IMF activities and policies to people outside, and hopefully people in this room are looking at our reports. And we also are a way of channeling outside views into the fund. So, for example, this is a session in which we also look forward to listening to your views about the fund, which we can then use in our work. So we have these three broad objectives. The one constraint we have from our terms of reference is that we shouldn't interfere with current operations. So we don't do evaluations of current lending programs, for example. But otherwise, we have a very broad remit to choose topics that we think are important. One other point I would emphasize is that the evaluation office is a little bit different from an auditing office or an inspector general. I used to work in U.S. Treasury, and in U.S. Treasury, everyone feared the inspector general because they would come and find fault, and people would fear that they were going to be kicked out or taken to court. That's not our role. We have a broader role in a way. We're not assessing performance against legislation and checking to see whether rules have been broken or not, but rather we have an open mandate to help the institution to improve its performance. And to do that, you need to have a good, positive relationship with the rest of the institution. You can't be overly antagonistic. So, in order for us to do our role, though, we have to be seen as independent. We're not part of the staff. We're not answerable to management. I was personally appointed by the executive board. I work for the executive board, but it's an arm's length relationship. The executive board doesn't tell me what to do. Rather, it's up to me to decide what topics to look at. It's up to me to decide who I want to work with, who I hire to work on the IEO staff. We can get access to virtually all information inside the fund, not just public information, but also internal documents. We have free access to IMF staff who are required to speak to us about their work. We have a budget that is independent. of the regular IMF staff budget. So we can't be punished if we write a critical report. We can't have our budget slashed the next year. And also to keep us honest ourselves, there is an external evaluation of our performance that occurs every 5 years, and I find it actually a very useful process to give us a stock taking of how we are doing, and also it's a moment to look at the overall structure of our office to make sure that we are having as much impact as we can. We're very small. We're only 15 people. We're much smaller than other evaluation offices in other IFIs. All the IFIs now have evaluation offices, the World Bank, the ADB, other regional development banks, but typically the other evaluation offices are very large. They produce lots of reports, but we think that because we're small, we can actually have a greater impact by being more strategic. We don't flood the market. I think there's a strong appetite at the board, management and staff for what we do. Our reports, when they come out, they get a lot of attention, and they really do impact the way the organization works, as I will describe. This flow chart shows our evaluation cycle. It typically takes us 12 to 18 months to complete an evaluation, from choosing the topic to presenting the topic to the board. Part of the reason it takes so long is we have a very careful, deliberative process. We want to make sure that we're hearing views from outside. We hire consultants from outside to channel external views. We weigh the evidence carefully. We also consult internally with staff, with management, and with the board. So that when we come up with our report, we feel that we have a report that has weight. It's not just the personal opinions that Prakash and I may come up with. I mean, we could easily write a report very quickly. I mean, we have lots of opinions, but that's not the purpose of the IO. The purpose of the IO is to produce a balanced assessment. And it's also the purpose of the IO to impact the way that the IMF operates. We're not just about writing in what we hope are nice readable reports, but also affecting the way the fund actually operates. So for us, the follow-up process is just as important as the preparation process. There's quite an elaborate follow-up process has evolved over the years. The first key event is the discussion of our report by the executive board. In our reports, we make a number of recommendations, maybe 5 or 6 recommendations, and the board then must decide whether to endorse our recommendations or not. And all the recommendations that are endorsed are then sent to management and staff, and they have to come up with an implementation plan within 6 months to say what they're going to do to respond to the recommendations. Every year, there's then an audit by the Office of Internal Audit at the fund. We call it periodic monitoring review, which actually assesses the progress that's been made in implementing the recommendations. There's a scorecard that's provided every year of what has been done and what hasn't been done. That's also discussed at the executive board. We also ourselves do reports on recurring issues, which are issues that typically come back time and time again in our evaluations. And then after 10 years, we do an update to see how much progress has been made in the area. So it's quite an extensive process of follow-up, but for us it's absolutely critical. We also do significant outreach. Part of the outreach is talking to groups like yourselves to explain what we're doing and key findings in our reports. But we also do what we call in-reach, where we talk to IMF staff, but try to make sure the IMF staff is absorbing the lessons that we are developing in our reports. Here's a list of some of our recent evaluations. Typically, we finish only around 2 reports a year. As Dharna mentioned, we had a report last year on the IMF and social protection. The year before, we finished 2 reports, one on the euro area crisis, which was a major report. It got a lot of attention. It was quite controversial, as you can imagine, in Europe. It's certainly worth taking a look at. And we also did a report on statistics at the IMF. And we've done a couple of recent updates on exchange rate policy advice and multilateral surveillance, which were evaluations we'd done 10 years ago. But to give you a little bit more of a flavor of exactly what it is that we do in a specific evaluation, I thought I would just talk a little bit more about the IMF and social protection report. It's available on our website if you're interested to look at it. Social protection is an issue that's certainly very challenging for the fund. I didn't choose the topic. I inherited the topic from my predecessor, but I was very happy with the topic. I think there's increasing realization in the fund that protecting the vulnerable from the impact of adjustment, from the impact of some of the global trends that Prakash mentioned, is really critical to maintaining macroeconomic stability, because if you don't have support for sensible macroeconomic policies, because those policies are damaging vulnerable groups, then you can have social stress, you can have political stress that leads to a reversal of the policies. So the fund has increasingly recognized this feedback loop, but at the same time the fund doesn't have very much of its own capacity to do the work. So it has to rely on partner institutions like the World Bank. So there are tensions there about exactly how does the fund go about doing that. And the fund also has to recognize what its own role is relative to others. I mean, there's a lot of attention to social protection by the broad community, the civil society. Groups like SMERU pay attention to it. So there's a question about the balance between what the fund promises to do and what the fund actually manages to do. So this slide here just briefly summarizes the main findings of the evaluation. Overall, we found that the fund has seriously stepped up its work in the area of social protection. Whether you look at the surveillance, whether you look at lending programs, capacity development, you see a significant increase in the attention that the fund has paid virtually across the board. However, we also found that the work on social protection was inconsistent. Sometimes it was very good, well researched, based on solid analysis. Sometimes, however, it seemed to be more of a box-ticking exercise. The team was told, well, you need to do something on social protection, so they'll add a few lines, but they don't really understand the issue. So that was one of our main concerns, was that there was a lack of consistency, a lack of coherence in the fund's work on social protection. We did find that the cooperation with the World Bank was actually quite successful, and that there was a good partnership between what the fund can bring and what the World Bank can bring. So the World Bank, they have the expertise on how do you design a social protection program. They have the expertise on how do you implement a social protection program, working with country officials. Where the IMF can come in on social protection is that it can make sure that there's adequate fiscal space in the budget for public spending on social protection. And also the fund can be influential. The fund typically has a hotline to the finance minister. The fund is able to persuade countries' senior political officials of the importance of paying attention to social protection issues, particularly at periods of stress. So the partnership has actually worked quite well. In terms of external communications, we found that there is a credibility gap. There's the fund rhetoric in terms of what it's promised to do in social protection has probably gone beyond what the fund can actually deliver. given its limited capacity. So the reactions to the report was, I think, very well received internally. Management supported the main findings of the report, and the executive board endorsed all of the key recommendations that we made in the report. The report also attracted quite a lot of attention outside from civil society. In fact, the management received quite a few letters from prominent civil society groups and academics noting the report and asking, well, what is the fund going to do about living up to the standards that it wants to achieve in this area? And I think that helped to make sure that the implementation plan that management and staff have produced, discussed in the board last month, it's quite a robust implementation plan. It's built around developing what we call an institutional view, a more coherent framework for how does the fund think about social protection in different circumstances. So it's less idiosyncratic, more coherent. And that's going to be a difficult challenge, because those of you who've been working on social protection know that there are some difficult unresolved issues. For example, the balance between a universal rights-based approach to social protection and a more targeted approach. How do you square the different objectives that you can have for social protection programs to protect the vulnerable, to respect the broader needs of the population, but also to fit within what is feasible from a budgetary perspective. So work is continuing at the fund. The staff has said it'll take them about a year to develop this new institutional view, and they've begun to consult with outside groups on exactly what this new institutional view would consist of. So that gives you a snapshot of one particular evaluation. This chart here is a summary of the findings from this annual review of the impact of our evaluations. As you can see, overall the impact is significant. 85% of all the recommendations that we've made have been endorsed by the board. There's been some action taken in around 3/4 of these recommendations. About 30%, around a third, have been fully implemented. But there are still many recommendations that have not been fully implemented, and that's something that we are concerned about, and something we think about. Is something that the external review of our activities is also thinking about. But I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, one has to be realistic. I mean, these are the issues that we identify are typically deep-seated issues and not subject to quick fixes. So it's not surprising that it takes time to address them. There's also criticism that, particularly in the past, some of our recommendations were too vague and not sufficiently concrete and monitorable. So that's a recommendation to us to be more specific and concrete about what we're putting forward. And then the third concern is that perhaps this elaborate follow-up process doesn't actually have enough force behind it. Maybe there are ways of tweaking it that will give greater potential for the executive board in particular to push management to make sure that it's implementing its implementation plan sufficiently forcefully. Let me just quickly move ahead. As I mentioned, there are periodic external evaluations of the IAO. There have been 2 so far, in 2006 and 2013. Both of them are quite positive, saying that the IMF, the IAO has done a good job, has served the IMF well, but also making a number of recommendations, including to make sure that we don't shy away from difficult topics, that we need to find ways to strengthen the follow-up process, and much of the present follow-up process was put in place after these reports came out, and in responding to the criticisms that were made, and also emphasizing the importance of outreach by the IEO when we do our reports, both external outreach and internal outreach. In terms of our current work program, we're just finishing up a report on the IMF's work on fragile states, countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor, Myanmar, countries which are very difficult for the fund, where there's a big need for help, given their weak institutions, given the security, political instabilities. But these are also environments where it's hard for the fund to operate. You can't do business as usual of the fund's activities, and we're just about to finish this report. It should be public within the next month or so. We're also doing a big report on financial surveillance, assessing to what extent the fund has been able to beef up its work on financial sector issues. As Prakash mentioned, there's been a big increase in resources in this area, but how effective has this work been? And then we're doing an assessment of the IMF's advice on unconventional monetary policy. In fact, this is the evaluation that Prakash himself is leading, where we're looking at the fund's advice not just to countries at the core of the global system, not just advice to the Fed, the ECB, the BOJ, but also the advice given to emerging markets affected by the spillovers from very easy monetary policies, so countries like Indonesia, for example. So we have we're covering a number of angles in that evaluation, which I think will be interesting. I should also mention that there is an external evaluation of us currently underway. It's being led by Donald Kaberuka, former president of the African Development Bank, and that should be finished this summer. So here are a number of possible issues for discussion. You should feel free to raise whatever you like. Ask us frank questions about what we're doing. But I mean, these are issues where we'd certainly be interested to hear your views. How well has the IMF adapted to new realities of the global environment? In particular, on the governance structure, to what extent has the governance structure adapted in a way to deal with some of the challenges, and in particular to increase the voice of emerging market countries like Indonesia, to evolve away from an institution that's dominated by guidance from a few of the larger, wealthier countries. And what about the IEO itself? Are we sufficiently transparent? Do we have enough impact? Are there topics that you think we could be taking on that would be very relevant from your perspective? So hopefully there's a broad range of issues that you'll be interested to discuss with us. So let me leave it there, and I'll pass the mic back to
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's give applause to Prakash and Charles for the excellent presentation. Now I would like to invite Professor Bambang Brojo to give his remark on the IEO, and especially on what do you think about the IEO? Does it really important for us, and what's your suggestion in terms of the future of the IEO for Indonesia?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for SMERU, Pak Darno and Pak Asep for inviting me for this event. And also, it's good to listen to direct presentation from the IMF IEO from both Charles and Prakash. And to be honest, I was not aware about the evaluation office. And then the first time I noticed about evaluation office is from the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. Because at that time, one Indonesian, Pak Rusdian Lubis, was part of the ADB evaluation office. But then I was not really much involved and never been in touch with the evaluation office of the ADB. And then the next opportunity came when I was invited by IFAD, and at that time I think I met you, Charles, in your new capacity as the director of IEO at IMF. By the way, I already met Charles, I think, couple years back when we were both together, kind of a deputy minister of finance. Of course, Charles representing the US and I'm representing Indonesia. And when I joined the discussion at IFAT, I think IFAT at that time also started the evaluation office. And I just realized, I think, the importance of evaluation office. And for IMF as well, I think for me, it's even more. Simply because if we are talking about development bank like World Bank, the ADB, or African Development Bank, Inter-American Development, Islamic Development Bank, usually they have a very intensive relationship with the member countries because they give loan, they have project, technical assistance, etc., etc. So whenever they are doing the operation in Indonesia, it's easier for this development financing institution to do evaluation. Sometimes they can do it through a special evaluation office, or they can do it through or by, let's say, hiring some independent reviewer to assess or to evaluate the success or failure of the operation of their institution in the member countries. But for IMF, because I used to be also alternate governor of IMF as Minister of Finance, I don't think the intensity of relationship is not as high as the development financing institution. So by doing that, I think the role of independent evaluation office is even more important because again, there is no intensive relationship, but because we are the member of the IMF and other financial institution, we need to know the benefit or what will be the impact of IMF to Indonesia, for example. And we hope that this is the area in which IEO of IMF can put more attention. Look at the significance of IMF or the impact of IMF existence or operation, if there is any operation, to respective countries. That will be the first thing I would like to propose to IEO of IMF. After this, I would like to discuss three specific issues. The first one about IMF with Indonesia. Second, I think about IMF and global dynamics. And the last one would be IMF and development issues, because both Prakash and Charles already mentioned those issues in their presentation. Let me start the first one about the relationship. Of course, when I have to make the conclusion about IMF relationship with Indonesia, we cannot stay away from what happened in the Asian financial crisis, 1998, in which I think that was the only time Indonesia is heavily involved with IMF, with the LOI, letter of intent, and all the IMF package until I don't know, I think the first term of SBY presidency. The conclusion, if we can derive from what happened during that period until now, is unfortunately we always call IMF stigma. Whenever the IMF word come up, let's say in the media or in any discussion in Indonesia, the first reaction is that photo actually, but the first reaction is kind of traumatic. So people will always, unfortunately, because it's very interesting, when the crisis happens in 1998, actually IMF trying to help Indonesia by, of course, stabilize the macroeconomic, especially our foreign exchange reserve. But since the IMF LOI and the crisis, of course, happened at the same time, so people sometimes who, of course, who do not understand or who do not want to understand will say that, oh, IMF is behind the crisis. That's their conclusion. And that becomes the stigma until now. So I think when I think Prakash mentioned about the FCL, for example, the one of the instrument of IMF actually to help uh, help strengthening the country to face the potential in global macro condition. I remember as a Minister of Finance at that time, I was at IMF office in Washington DC, and then we had I think a very close meeting with some IMF official, especially from the, is that the Asian department or East Asia? Yeah, the what is it? The department that dealing with Indonesia, and we are trying to talk about the idea of FCL because we learned the FCL has been very effective. I remember they mentioned about Poland and Mexico. Because of using this FCL, they can go through the, as you know, the Fed rate increase relatively in more stable condition. So that at that time the potential risk is coming from the Fed rate hike. But since those countries, already protecting themselves using the FCL, somehow, of course, we also have been going through very well, but they also doing well, and part of that because of the FCL. So it's very tempting actually to use the FCL, and then this is more preventive rather than curative. But then, after discussion, after having the meeting at IMF office, we went back to Jakarta. We had, close meeting internally, of course, with Bank Indonesia as well. We decided not to, because the FCL is bad, or not because we think that our economic condition is so stable, but simply because we don't want to deal with the politics. We don't want to deal with this IMF stigma. So, based on this situation, I believe one of the maybe very interesting topic for you, Charles, is the lessons from Indonesia. How can the IMF package? I mean, first, of course, evaluation whether this package has been successful or not in general or in detail. But and secondly, how can IMF? I mean, after the implementation of the package, be perceived as a acceptable institution in that country, because I think you issued one report about crisis in Portugal and everything, so maybe you can do some kind of comparison. What happened in Portugal, for example, after the IMF so-called operation, and what happened in Indonesia after IMF operation. I think that will be very interesting kind of comparative study. And I believe we can also look even more deeply if we use also the other Asian countries. I don't know whether during the Asian financial crisis, IMF also has kind of intensive operation, for example, in South Korea or in Thailand. I don't know, because at that time, I just graduated from PhD, so I don't know much about the detail of the Indonesian economic management. But I think it's interesting to know. And to be honest, I think we have to also do the comparison between Indonesia and Malaysia, because Indonesia really taking the IMF package, while Malaysia, as you know, didn't do anything about the IMF, and somehow they also survived the crisis. So this kind of evaluation or analysis, I think, will be very good for the input of the future IMF operation in any other countries, whether it's a fragile country or the country that looks stable but somehow still vulnerable to the potential of the crisis. And the other thing, of course, I think we need to work together to actually to remove this IMF stigma. I think everybody who's reading social media, especially not the formal media, the social media. I mean, managing director, right? Managing director Lagarde came to the office, came to the town, and the reaction is IMF coming because Indonesia is in the brink of the crisis. That's the title of the social media. So again, the stigma is still there. Even now, when we are going to host the IMF World Bank annual meeting, and I know very well, Christine is in town because she wants to check on hand about our preparation. Especially she has a concern about, as you know, Mount Agung eruption. So nothing to do with the IMF package. And I was with President. I was accompanying President when we met the IMF delegation. At that time, I'm wondering why you are not there, Charles. But after looking at your presentation, I know that you have to make the distance with the executive at the IMF. So during the meeting, there has been some discussion about the economics, macroeconomics, but nothing to do with the serious thing. I mean, it's more on how IMF can be involved with the development issues. This is topic that I will discuss last. So again, the image is still there, the stigma is still there. I think we need to work out because it's not good for Indonesia itself if there is a good facility, but then somehow we cannot use it simply because of the stigma, not because of the technical reason. So that is the first thing I would like to raise about the possible role of the independent evaluation office. And then Charles, I remember when I was at DC during I think one of the annual meeting, I was walking from the main gate of the World Bank toward the exit of the annual meeting, which is close to the new IMF office building. I remember, I don't remember who told me this, but when I was walking with some people, somebody pointing out to the new building and saying, look, this new IMF building, because IMF has two buildings now, one is the old one and the other is newer one. Look, this IMF new building was built after Indonesian financial crisis. It means IMF get money from Indonesia and can build the new buildings. Can you imagine how important Indonesia for IMF? I mean, if that rumor is true, so I just want to share with you, Charles, because I think the stigma is so deep. I think it's good to know. It's good that independent evaluation realize how deep stigma about IMF in Indonesia. About the second issue, IMF and global dynamics. Again, I remember my experience as finance minister in the G20. There was one issues that lingering on 2 or 3 years of the G20 meetings. And the issues about, what is it? Capital submission to IMF. I mean, meaning that how can member countries increase the capital of IMF, and of course making IMF more relevant and making IMF more powerful in supporting the stability of the global economy. And at that time, unfortunately, when other countries already agree with the additional capital submission to IMF, there was one country, unfortunately your country, Charles, US, that blocked that capital submission. So this issue lingering, I think, for 2 or 3 years, and finally solved after finally the US president agree and the Congress also agree about this. Why I raise this important point? I think we are now dealing with the global dynamics. We are dealing with the new economic landscape. Of course, in the past, the so-called Bretton Woods institution established by, at that time, the most powerful economy. Of course, US, Western Europe, and Japan. But recently, of course, we can see the increasing role of China, the increasing role of India, and the increasing role of some emerging economies. And to some extent, I believe emerging economies would like to have more say in IMF. But somehow, I think internally there was still kind of, debate, argument, whether these so-called the big boys would like to give more room for these new boys. And that has been, I think, one of the potential block of IMF progress in the future. I mean, of course, I believe yuan has been part of the global currency basket, but other emerging economies would like to be in the better position when it's dealing with the IMF management, dealing with the IMF decision, especially to support macroeconomic stability all around the world. And then the other side of global dynamics would be the economic dynamic itself. Of course, development issues still the same, unemployment, poverty, etc., etc. But now we are dealing with, I think, quite a challenging issue. And I think everybody's talking about that. And even the conference yesterday at BI also touching the issue about digital economy, about, in more general, Industrial Revolution 4.0. And then part of digital economy will touch directly the financial sector. For example, I mean, if IMF still paying attention to the monetary stability, of course we know it's about money supply, money demand, interest rate, etc., etc. But now, how can this so-called traditional monetary policy dealing with, for example, peer-to-peer lending, in which the lending not given by, formal financial institution like bank or other financing institution, but given, for example, by myself to Padarno, and we can do it just through the online connection, through the internet. So Padarno access my website, for example, and Padarno asks, let's say, 5 million rupiah loan, to set up his warung, for example. And then after looking at Padarno's proposal, I agree. I'll give you 5 million. Just like that. Padarno doesn't have to go to the bank, doesn't have to show the collateral, and doesn't have to sign anything related to this loan. It's just good proposal, and everything will be done through internet connection. And this will be just a small example. I think with the progress of the digital economy and Industrial Revolution 4.0, we will face even with bigger issue of the peer-to-peer lending as one example. And then, of course, another big issue would be the e-commerce. How can even the financial institutions survive in the future if everything can be done through e-commerce, and the payment system, for example, now can be done not by the bank, but even by apps. I think, of course, the Indonesian know about Gojek, and then now they already developed GoPay, for example, and everybody else also trying to do the advancement of financial technology, fintech. So at the end, bank might not be necessary, or bank might not be the only way for us to do the transaction. Everything can be done directly. So not just payment system, even loan or lending process can be done directly. So with this kind of global dynamics, of course, I think IMF really needs to adapt, of course, as an institution. But for Independent Evaluation Office, I think the most important thing now, as one of the study, is how this digital economy or Industrial Revolution 4 will affect the traditional or the original monetary policy. I think everything will be totally different, and we have to avoid the chaos, because I'm afraid if people are not well informed or people are not well educated, they can be in the confusion, and confusion can lead to the chaos if we just let this digital advancement not regulated. So I think that will be my second point regarding, I mean, the second issues regarding the global dynamic. The last and the third and the last would be about IMF, the issue of economic development. And this is the issue in which evaluation of LOI between Indonesia and IMF 1998 will be very much relevant. One thing that very interesting for me, before 1998, between 1990 to 1997, as I think many of Indonesian colleagues know, I would say, I mean, from the data at least, that was maybe the best economic performance of Indonesia all time. If you look at history, back history, until now, there is no year, there is no period in which our economy is as good as 1990 to 1997. Number one, economic growth. Average economic growth at that time is basically more than 6%. Sometimes in 1 year we can grow 7%, we can grow 8%. That's number one. Number two, this high economic growth supported not by the community, but supported by manufacturing. At that time, manufacturing sector contribution to GDP in Indonesia almost 30%. Today, 20%. So at the time, Indonesia is almost an industrialized country with the 30% manufacturing contribution. And at that time, we are very competitive in terms of export. Our export is dominated by the labor-intensive manufacturing product, either footwear, garment, textile, electronics, everything that's labor-intensive, Indonesia is very strong. So export is very good. And then, at the time also, we have done some deregulation. So prior to 1990s, Indonesia did some kind of reform. Number one is tax reform, and number two is real sector deregulation, and also banking sector deregulation. So the result accumulated during the period of 1990 to 1997. Of course, there was one flaw during that period. We do not care too much about stability. We do not care too much about the, excessive growth in the banking sector. So as a result, the banking sector collapsed. I mean, the currency, banking sector, and finally the real sector. But the question is, after LOI of IMF, and we can call it a recovery period, we've never been back to that period. Now we have, I think, more regulated banking sector. I think more and more banks in Indonesia are much prudent than that period. We have floating exchange rate. So our exchange rate is following the market rather than pegged at certain rate. And then we have relatively sound fiscal policy. We always manage our budget deficit below 3%. So all the requirement for stability is there. So if you look at the textbook used by mostly of IMF staff, everything is there. The question is, why can our growth be back to 7 or 8% like that period? And why the economy now dominated by commodity instead of manufacturing? Of course, manufacturing is still the biggest in terms of contribution to GDP, but 20% is not enough, And then the FDI in Indonesia is still it's okay, but not that fast. So we are wondering if all stability condition is around, why can't we have that kind of growth. Why can't we have this 1997 economic growth? Something must be missing. So if I trying to make a relation with the IMF LOI, because if you remember, IMF LOI is not just about banking sector, it's not just about financial sector, it's about everything. It's including the real sector, including all the all the regulation about rice, about oil, everything. So basically it touched all aspects of the economy, but somehow didn't help our economy even until now to be back at the condition prior to Asian financial crisis. So I believe my suggestion, whenever there is a special operation like potential crisis in any member countries, there has to be evaluation after, like the Portugal case. But then, since your office just established in 2001, after financial crisis, I think it's still good, still relevant to do the evaluation of the package itself, meaning that whether the so-called IMF recipe really fits with the Indonesian economic recovery. I think that will be very good, because we can expect in the future, whenever there is another country, for example, like Indonesia or look like Indonesia in the economic structure having problem, then they can come up with a better package. Or if we have another problem in the future, IMF can come with a better recipe than during the LOI. So I think this is important. And maybe one missing thing about IMF is, I think already mentioned in the presentation, IMF staff maybe have limited capacity beyond the macro issue, especially fiscal and monetary. And this will be related to development, real sector and everything. So there are two things IMF can do. First, of course, to bolster the staff in the area of development and real sector. But if IMF doing this too much, then they will overlap with the neighbor across the street, which is the World Bank. And I think it's not good, because I think with both these Bretton Woods institutions need to complement each other. So I would like to suggest maybe part of the evaluation office is to evaluate whether this collaboration between World Bank and IMF have been at the ideal situation. I think you touched a little bit about the World Bank, but I believe the collaboration, coordination, things like that, I think will be very much critical. So if you are talking about, let's say, the potential impact of IMF operation, let's say, to the poverty of member countries, don't let the IMF staff to do everything, but involve the World Bank staff if you think it's necessary. And I mean, because I know that it will be very costly if you set up special department for development, and then the neighbor across the street will ask IMF, why you do the same thing like me, So, and then I'm afraid after that World Bank will do, okay, we will do monetary policy analysis, of certain member countries. So I don't think it's good for the Bretton Woods institution, but it's important for IMF, especially if you come up with the recipe that touching all the sectors, involving many sectors in order to maintain the macroeconomic stability. So it's beyond fiscal and monetary, but somehow you need to involve other institutions and make sure the programs will be effective and efficient to really solve the problem. I think this will be my remarks. Sorry if a little bit too long, but the evaluation office, I think, will play a critical role, so IMF can do kind of the self-reflection. And Indonesia, I think, is a good example, because Indonesia has been one of the big, client of IMF in the past, And then, as I mentioned, the stigma is still around. So maybe one challenge of the evaluation office, how to give recommendation to IMF management and staff, to remove the stigma. I don't know. I mean, something has to be done because it's not good if we are still member countries, but stigma is there. If we are not member countries, it's okay. Because stigma is okay because we are not member countries. But this is funny because we are member countries. We have the privilege to to utilize some of the facilities, but we don't want to use it simply because of stigma. And of course, I mean, it's out of question. We are trying to, because I think Charles, I think years ago after the completion of IMF LOI, there was some ideas of course, this is more a kind of radical idea. Why don't we withdraw from IMF? And of course, some rational people will tell you, I think that's not good. That's not the intention of us getting rid of the IMF program or IMF package. IMF still important. Macroeconomic stability is there, and then don't forget, we still have one critical issue from macro perspective. As you know, our main source of government debt is issuing the bonds. Currently, the ownership of the foreign investor to our government bonds in rupiah is 40%. And 40%, in terms of to GDP, I know it's relatively safe, 27, 28, 29. But I think the one thing that worrying a little bit is the 40% foreign ownership. And that's the reason why we still need IMF around. Of course, we don't want bad thing happen, but we have to be cautious. We always have to take precaution. So I think we need IMF, but we want IMF also to maybe to understand more about Indonesia, and we need to work together how to remove the stigma itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bambang, for your many ideas and interesting insight. Charles, Prakash, you have many homework. I will respond later on. I hope that you will still be able to stay for a couple hours, or maybe not until lunchtime, so we can have the time to discussion. Pak Mark, now the floor is yours. Without last but not least, if you can limit your presentation for about 15 minutes, so we can have more discussion.
Thank you, Pak Darno. Thank you, Pak Darno. Pak Bambang yang saya hormati, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoons. First of all, I would like to thanks for this opportunity to SMERU, to giving me such a time to share my view about the IMF. I think after I listen presentation from Pak Bambang, I think I would like to write maybe an opinion about move on about the move on from IMF, or maybe you can forgive, but you cannot forget. Okay, I think that's the first slide that so how about the mixed feeling about the Indonesian, about the IMF itself, right? That's what Pak Bambang say, and I will put on the historical perspective about this situation, because by understanding the historical perspective, maybe we can change our strategy of engagement with Indonesians, or maybe we can bring more dialogues, more partnerships, or what the process itself that we need to develop in when dealing with the Indonesian government. So this is actually Indonesia have the second the first time we need IMF in the 1996, in 1966, yes, when we have hyperinflations. We asked IMF to come to help Indonesians, and I think we come with the good results, very fantastic. And at the time, both Indonesia and IMF can work together, and Indonesian economy can recover from the crisis, from the hyperinflations, and we can reach very high economic growth. And another things, the second one, we asked help from IMF in 1997. And if in 1966 the primary objective was to lower inflations in dealing with collaboration with IMF, but in 1997 we are dealing with how to restore the confidence after the rupiah get huge of depreciations. And the packets was implemented over 3 years period and to be tightly monitored by the Indonesian government, assisted by experts from IMF, World Bank, and others. So not only IMF, but also other agencies also involved. So I tried to look more detail on the literatures from the Indonesian economists, such Professor Sadli discuss about the situations during the Asian economic crisis. I think this statement quite shocking, yes, because it's quite clear how the IMF mishandling the Indonesian situation at the times. And also there's a statement about the hidden agenda of IMF itself in helping the Indonesians, because there's a lot of country also try to put Indonesian to reduce the tariff itself at the times. So this is not clear. This is the agenda of IMF or the agenda of the member itself that try to put Indonesians on putting a lot of tasks on the letter of intent itself. So and then I would like to say about the credible policy itself, that I think this is my personal evaluation. Maybe the case of Indonesia also one of the trigger factor why IMF need to set up the IMF itself, yes, because at the time the credibility and has become so big problem for the IMF. So it has been 15 years this agency. Actually, I'm not quite familiar or get in touch with the IO, because I usually read the IMF report, yeah, such as what economic outlooks, and then working papers, IMF working papers, finance and development, and so that's actually the reference that I use to study about the product of IMF. But later, after the invitation from the SMERU, I tried to understand what about the IMF itself, what is work, what I've done, and I tried to collect all the report, more 27 reports. Yeah, I tried to skip what is the report about, and my personal evaluation, I think this is fantastic. This is fantastic because in the case of the evaluation itself, yeah, I'm thinking in the main problem is who evaluate who. I think the Indonesia pengawasan, ya, siapa mengawasi siapa, who evaluate who is a big problem. But after I read, I think the report is fantastic, it's quite objective in my opinions, quite critical to IMF itself on the report. I think this is good. So with that kind of evaluation, it bring me input to read more carefully on the product of IMF itself. I think that's the thing that I learned. So and then I tried to look on some of the report. For example, how the report evaluate about the crisis in 1997, 98 in designing crisis, its crisis management strategy during the IMF. IMF also, the report also acknowledged there's some problems in handling the crisis itself from the IO reports. And then I also tried to find another report. This is a statement from the report. An important challenge is to reduce the perceived tension between funds, dual rules, trusted advisors, and watchdogs. And then also another challenge facing the fund is improving value-added and relevant fund advice, including through enhancing country-specific knowledge. I think this is a very important insight from the IMF report itself. And then I also find another statement from other reports. For example, the issue has affected the IMF performance in all course area of responsibility lending. The recurrence in the different contexts in multiple evaluations just said are intrinsic to the nature of the institutions with deep roots on its culture, politics, and governance. So I think the element about the culture, policy, governance, I think that mostly ignored by many international agencies. They bring with their own judgment. They bring with their own rules rather than acknowledging the cultures, the policy, the politics in the country itself. And then also there's another report that I took, the routed data. I think this report also highlight the importance of the data itself. So I think it is good if with the same data, with the same open data, we can use data with all the researchers can use it. So we can have more we can have more literature or review about the data itself. So I think it is good if also IMF can give such advice to the Indonesian governments how to open the data. So many researchers can also do the same thing like IMF do. So this will be more checks and balance and in using the data, such as some of data from the BPS still closed, and if we can have to get, we have to pay with substantial amount of money. So I think we can work together between the Indonesian scientists, IMF scientists, and can we work together to make a more robust studies. So this is the key point that I learned from the report itself. The report highlight the importance to understand the country-specific factors. The advice is sometimes was generics, like appreciation of country circumstances, insufficient to local condition, local capacity. So this is kind of a critics that the agency give to the IMF. And then I also find another quite a similar tone regarding insufficient emphasis on the domestic ownerships, poorly focused conditionality, political consideration. So I think this is important. So if I ask IMF staff reading, maybe my ear is a bit red to read because it's very critical, to critical review in my opinions. So and then IMF and governance. Actually, yeah, I think government needs to be put as a main course in analyzing any policy advice for developing countries such as Indonesians. So this is also one scholars asking about what is a good governance. So it followed by conditionality that imply to transfer of sovereignty. I think all of this element has been also discussed in the IO report. I think this is good, yeah. And then another about good governance also discussed by Grindels, what is essentials and what is not. I think all this element also has been adopted in the IO report because as you see, sometimes the recommendation maybe not quite applicable. It is not necessary. I think that's also good. And then another issue is maybe that I'm thinking quite important in terms of government also how the IMF can develop more framework on the collaborative governance. I hope by the visit of the managing directors Christine Lagarde to the Pertamina hospitals and then to the Tanah Abang market, I think that can develop kind of the collaborative signal to the government. They try to understand and try to change the stigma that IMF is more one side force rather than discussion collaborative. So I think this kind of signal need to be so in more intensive letters, yeah. So maybe later we'll come to another side or outside Java, visit Papua and others. So maybe the stigma about the IMF on the majority of Indonesia will gradually change. So I would like to emphasize on the importance of collaborative process between the Indonesian and IMF leaders. And then we also develop our center, Economic Research Center, also developed another concept of governance we call proper governance. I think with the 4 foundations that will be a critical elements also in dealing collaboration with Indonesians. One of the 2, I think the most quite important is socially inclusive and local content. And those 2 elements also have been several times mentioned by the IO reports. And then, yeah, I think this is quite interesting to see this picture. What is the topic? I agree with Pak Bambang. This is about how about the disruptive technology and job creations. If I try to understand many surveys regarding the economic situation of Indonesia, many respondents aware about the job security itself due to technology disruption because it changed a lot of job structures. But on the other hand, the capability to adapt with the new environment is not there. And then macroeconomic stability. I agree with Pak Bambang, especially after the financial crisis 1997, the industrial recovery is very, very slow. So we have a premature deindustrialization in Indonesia. This will be very, very big problem for our country because the premature industrialization actually can waste a lot of investment in Indonesia. For example, I would like to say that why currently we have excess capacity on electricity because few industry absorb the industry that can absorb a lot of electricity is not growing. So this is the excess demand of electricity because the demand side from the industry. So how we can promote the industrial sectors growing and growing in the futures? A lot of policy have been there, but why the industrial sector is quite declining? And then another issue about the sovereign bond market, as Pak Bambang say, we have more complicated. What is the sovereign bond market? More complicated and more tradables that involve a lot of foreign transactions. How it will affect the stability the Indonesian bond market itself. And then also price stability and energy subsidy. Indonesia still give a lot of subsidy on LPGs, electricity. I think the IMF also provide a lot of study on pacing up the subsidy itself. And then let's see how the next pace out of subsidy can be implemented in Indonesia with low impact on the poor itself. Sustainability of social protections. Yeah, last year we have a deficit for about 9 trillion rupiah on the BPJS on the social protections. And then a complexity of government debt. Later I will say this is quite complex how the central government loan, yes, that lot of instruments, they are also tradables owned by foreigners, and how it affect the stability of the bond market later. And then another issue is about the infrastructure financings. They will be also quite important because I'm a bit worried with the current government. They spend a lot of money on infrastructures, but maybe this is not what we want. That's not will bring a substantial effect on the economic development, on economic growth itself. So I'm thinking, yeah, in the short run, that's right, in the short run. But many evidence also indicate that the infrastructure that we develop also not help a lot of the poor itself. For example, the big port, yes, the big ports. Actually, many small fishermen that complain about the big port because according to them, with the big port, they will change the ecosystems and the fishing pattern, the flow of fish and others. So for their perspective, this is not what they want actually, because after that, government like to do what is the maintenance to open the what is the muara, yeah? Pendangkalan muara. That's a big problem for many a big port in Indonesia. So we need to evaluate how the infrastructure really effective for the poor itself. Financial inclusion, similar with Pak Bambang say, this will be quite important for Indonesia. Will change the pattern of transactions, and then especially also the poor. Now they have to have a bank account. Many poor people have to have bank account now, and then also the possibility for fintechs to get access from other source instead of bankings. Early warning crisis, especially how it's possible if kind of fintech bubbles, or what the possible risk crisis that Indonesia will face, that Indonesia need to prepare. Informal economy also quite important for us, but not much study in this area. Yeah. And then also how the impact of cryptocurrency on the financial stability of the globals and how its impact on Indonesia. So basically that's kind of the idea that maybe IEO can propose to do the evaluation for the next year. Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Pak Mark. Thank you for your comment. Now we started late, about 30 minutes. So if you allow us, we would like to use the next 30 minutes, Pak. 30 minutes, 40 minutes for Q&A. Oh, you have to leave? Maybe. Okay, you have to leave at 12. So maybe if we can, pick up a couple of questions, can you just move the chair here, Pak? So that Pak Bambang can sit here and all the speaker, and then we can have Q&A, and then maybe I will prioritize Pak Bambang to, respond to question if there is any, and then you can also, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. You are there. And then if IMF would like to respond to what Pak Bambang said, that will also be good. Now I would like to open up a few QA. State your name and to whom you question addressed to. In the next 10 minutes for Pak Bambang, that will be very useful for us. Silakan, monggo Pak. Ada mic, tolong.
Thank you. My name is Fariel Anwar from the Currency Management Group. As an independent evaluation office, I would like to know what is your evaluation and recommendation for some critical issue I would like to ask. The first one is there are many exchange rate systems in the world. Fixed exchange rate, floating, managed floating exchange rate, and peg system. What is the best system for country like Indonesia to manage the stability of exchange rate in the uncertainty and volatile global market like now? What is the positive and negative side? The second one is the shifting of the global economy to digital and robotic economy. And digital currency has significant impact for the industrial companies, education system, and government as a policy makers. My question is, what should the companies respond to this condition? How can government support job creation for a country like Indonesia, who have population more than 200 million people, in the growth of digital and fintechs? What should the education system should do? And the last one, what the bank central as monetary authority should do to the growing of the fintech and cryptocurrency in the global economy, especially managing the risks. There is a positive side and there is negative side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak. So can I have one more or two more? If you have any question to Pak Bambang while he is here, go ahead. He has to leave, yeah. Victor and you. He has to leave at 12.
Yes, thank you. My name is Witio. I am from UCK. Yeah, my short question is to Pak Bambang and maybe Charles. Right now, in over the world, I think a lot of countries very still confused, hoping about the cryptocurrency or maybe about the financial technology. And Pak Bambang already mentioned before that we should avoid the chaos. And what should we do? I think from the government side, from OJK side right now. Also, I think last year we already have the what you call is pengaturan regulation about this peer-to-peer lending, Pak, from OJK. And right now, it's still a small part of the financial technology. And what next, according to Pak Bambang, or maybe according to Charles? Thank you.
Hector, last question on the first session.
Thank you all very much for very interesting presentations. Pak Bambang, this question is particularly for you. My name is Hector Salazar Salam. I'm with the Makota program, working very closely with Pak Darno and then Petuaka. As we go into the next phase of the RBGM so the midterm development plan, one of the key questions that comes up for me is the role of decentralization as we're thinking about developing manufacturing, redeveloping manufacturing, thinking about the new creative economies, all of the things that we've discussed today about the future of development in Indonesia. How does that intersect with a growing decentralized context? And what is the role of Bappenas, in your view, moving into the 20s?
Thank you. Pak Bambang?
I think first regarding the peer-to-peer lending, although the peer-to-peer lending may be still maybe very very small in the size compared to, of course, the overall transaction in Indonesia, but I think we need to pay attention to what happened in China. In China, I think they are really cashless society now. And with Alipay, they can simply pay everything not by cash, but by this, by the cell phone. And even the society in China is not just cashless, but maybe in the more extreme one, we can call it walletless. You don't need wallet. You don't need to carry wallet if you want to do any transaction. What you need to do is just bring this cell phone. And following what happened in China, what I understand also in China, the peer-to-peer lending becomes even more advanced. Advanced in the case that let's say the approval of the loan proposal, I mean, in the peer-to-peer lending could be done now in minutes. That's what I heard, because somebody, proposed the loan, of course, with the proposal and everything. And I heard less than 30 minutes or less than 15 minutes is already a decision by the lender whether they will give the loan or not. So with this kind of advancement, I believe there will be more and more people trying to find a loan from this kind of online transaction. And this is the topic that I think IMF, of course, not just the evaluation office, but IMF in general needs to take into account. And the independent evaluation office role would be, giving the recommendation. I think the digital economy, industrial revolution 4.0 has been very serious. And we cannot take lightly, what happened with the current situation, let's say with the peer-to-peer lending. So it's hard to imagine, for example, for teachers like you, when you teach the students about this peer-to-peer lending, I mean, compared to this, your textbook of monetary policy. So something has to be done. I mean, of course, it's not on the academic side, but more practical, I think, from the IMF side, as the only institution that dealing with the monetary and macro policy. And this is very serious, and that's also the reason why I mentioned in my presentation, countries like China and India should be or should have a greater role in IMF, because the advancement that I mentioned happened in China, not really in the US, not really in the Western Europe. It happened in China and it happened fast. So I think the role of China, I think, will be critical, and IMF needs to anticipate sooner rather than later. On the next question about Bappenas' role in the next 5 years medium-term plan, we are now in the preparation of, setting up this 5 years medium-term plan, and certainly one missing part of our economy, as I mentioned also in the presentation, is how we revitalize our manufacturing sector. And we trying now to combine not only manufacturing sector, but also the services. So basically it's about value added both in manufacturing and services. Or we can also call modern manufacturing as well as modern services. Why we have to, focus on these two issues? We realize that Indonesia now in the already almost 20 years in the middle income trap. And this is not just middle income trap, lower middle income trap. And I think it will be hard, for example, for Indonesia to catch up with South Korea. Because South Korea in 20 years, they already graduate from middle income to high income level. So we need to find something to accelerate this, the period to get rid of middle income trap. And the answer lies on, I think, two things. I think one is value added process. I think we need to do more processing rather than relying on the natural resources. And the focus will be on manufacturing and services. Services may be the most, important now would be tourism. While for manufacturing, I think this is the area in which we are still struggling. We cannot go back to the labor-intensive manufacturing because we already democratized country, labor union is so strong, and then, of course, the labor wage is now much higher than countries like Myanmar, like Bangladesh, and everything. So we cannot expect too much advantage on the area. So we need the new type of manufacturing, and this will be the area that our focus in the next RPGMN. I think we need to pay attention to what kind of manufacturing that will be the Indonesian strength and in which we have the competitive advantage in the international market. The other thing, I think, the other sectors that will be important for growth, agriculture. So far, our agriculture is too much on the food issues, food security, while we forget that we have a lot of export potential from our agriculture products other than the food products. I mean, you name it. I mean, it's coffee, tea, and then rubber. But we haven't really paid attention except maybe for palm oil. So we need to diversify the export of agriculture itself, not just diversify export from agriculture to manufacturing, even within agriculture itself, we need to diversify not just palm oil with many other things. So there are a lot of potential of agriculture products that so far hasn't been able to compete in the international market. And I'm always fascinated by what Malaysia is doing now, in which they export a lot of durian to China. And as a result, now there are so many farmers becoming rich simply because of durian. Something that maybe you cannot expect happening in the countries that already have a lot of export of palm oil. So I think that diversification of agriculture product and export is another important agenda aside from promoting, certain type of manufacturing that will be our, competitiveness and promoting more the tourism in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Pak Bambang. I forgot to mention that while during discussion, feel free to pick up tea, coffee on your right. But Pak Bambang has to go. But if you have just 1 second, I would like to respond to Pak Bambang comment on your presentation. If you wish, maybe just very brief about. He has many expectations, and some of them I think is very difficult to do because he is asking you to do a counterfactual. Unfortunately, we cannot randomize countries,
That's true. So I thought the comments from both Bambang and Dr. Max were very helpful. Interesting analysis of the past and also many rich suggestions for a future agenda. Will certainly keep us busy for a very long time. On the stigma issue. I mean, certainly it's very, very much uppermost in the IMF's mind that there is this continuing barrier to a close relationship between the IMF and countries in Asia, like Indonesia, even 20 years later, despite the fact that countries in Asia over the past 20 years have performed well, particularly Indonesia. It's one of the fastest growing G20 countries. They won't be as fast as before the crisis, but nevertheless, it's still quite impressive. I think the fund is working to address the stigma issue. I think the fact that the annual meetings are going to be in Bali in October, the fact that the managing director is spending a week in Indonesia, that she spent many hours with President Jokowi on Monday, and the pictures you showed illustrated that she is really trying to get to grips to understand it more deep, with greater depth, what's happening in Indonesia by visiting the markets. She's visiting a water facility. She's going to spend the rest of the week really learning about Indonesia. So that, I think, part of the addressing the stigma issues is by showing a greater willingness to understand in depth what's happening in a country. But the other part of the stigma issue, of course, is to what extent is the fund giving a greater role to countries like Indonesia, the emerging market countries, in the internal governance, and that's something that we have looked at in the IAO. We did a report 10 years ago on IMF governance, and we're now beginning to update that report. And in that, we will take up a number of the issues. I mean, one of the changes that we have seen over the past 10 years is there has been a shift in voting power within the fund towards the fast-growing emerging markets, including China, Indonesia, Brazil. We've seen a shift in the number of board seats towards emerging markets. We've also seen a shift, as Prakash mentioned, greater role of the G20 relative to the G7 in giving guidance to the fund about what its agenda should be. The G20, Indonesia is a permanent member of the G20. Indonesia now has a seat at the table that it can use to influence the global direction. Okay.
Member of
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Another 20 minutes. Thanks, sir.
Appreciate it.
Okay. No, we are saying we still have
about 20 minutes. We haven't responded to Pak Anwar question about very specific question to you. Sorry, he has to leave, and then also comment on Mark's comments, and then we will invite more from the floor. Would you like to respond to his question?
I think exchange rate.
Yeah. When you ask me a question like that, I actually have a number of different hats that I can put on, so I can answer in different directions.
Yeah.
So one hat is my current hat is director of the IAO, and what we do is we don't specifically answer the question, well, what is the optimal exchange rate for this country, but rather we look at what is the IMF's advice to countries about what is the optimal exchange rate. And that's actually an issue that we have looked at. We did an update of our report on the IMF's exchange rate policy advice, which looked exactly at this question. But the answer, I think you'll find a little bit disappointing, because the answer we found was that the IMF actually didn't give very clear advice on what countries' exchange rate policy should be, but rather the fund's approach has been more, well, it's up to the country to choose your exchange rate regime, and then once you've chosen your regime, we'll give you advice on how to implement it best to be sustainable, to be sufficient, to be consistent with growth. And our report basically said, well, the fund should be able to go beyond that to actually give advice on what the country ought to be doing. The difficulty is it's a very sensitive issue. It's often quite political. The countries don't really want to get the IMF's advice in some cases. The exchange rate regimes are chosen for political reasons, not for economic reasons. And the second reason is it's also highly market sensitive. So if it gets into the press that the fund is recommending to a country with a fixed exchange rate regime that it should float the regime, that could lead to a great deal of market stress. So the fund is quite cautious not to be seen as rocking the boat in that way. And maybe it's too cautious. And I tend to agree with you. I think this is an important issue. There's a lot of debate outside the fund, and I think it's an area where the fund should be able to have an impact and bring its experience and analysis to bear.
Maybe just to emphasize what Charles was saying through an example. Last month I was in Denmark, which has had a fixed exchange rate after it went through a major crisis in the 80s. Now you would think that this is a country that could over time choose to introduce greater flexibility, but it is completely against the IMF talking about the exchange rate regime at all. So, it's not just an issue for emerging markets. Even a very advanced country like Denmark, which you think 30 years later should be able to move away from a peg, is completely unwilling to let the IMF talk about the peg in public because they're just worried about the kind of market reaction that Charles was describing. So I think the IMF is caught in a very difficult situation of not wanting to really cause a crisis in a country by talking about exchange rate pegs, even if it feels that over time the pegs are creating some major structural difficulties in the country.
Great, thank you. I would like to invite the second round, maybe in the last round. If you have any comment, question to the presentation, otherwise I would like to ask Javier, do you have anything? Okay. Yep, satu. Silakan.
Thank you. My name is Mafto. I'm from Prakarsa. Two things that I will address. The first is substance. Substance.
Substance, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Regarding independent evaluator office of IMF, I have one maybe suggestion in the next evaluation that put SDGs as the one topic, maybe the one major topic in the evaluation processes, because I heard a lot of the core issue in IMF changed. For example, inequality as a core business right now, gender mainstreaming on fiscal policy already running in some countries, not only as a pilot project but also mainstream project, and so on and so on. So it's the first thing that I address. The second is the process, how the evaluation work. As we know, the window of IMF quite open right now. IMF frequently invite a lot of CSO to be annual meeting fellow or summer meeting fellow in DC, and giving a lot of opportunity to CSO held a side event and discuss directly to the fund. But on evaluation side, I'm quite missing the window opportunity from CSO side to give some input or
okay, very good. You got your point. Very Very interesting point. Now, if there is no more question and remark, I would like to give the Charles and Prakash to respond to that, and then I also would like to reiterate it, the question from Pak Mark later on, which basically on the not the stigma. I think his point was mostly about the how serious you are in evaluating your own colleague, because you also previously working on the IMF or something like that. I think that's what his point. I didn't ask that question, but it's coming from him. Maybe he will have additional question. Okay, go ahead, brother.
Yeah. So I think that um, I think you're right that these new initiatives on inequality, gender, and so on have gone from pilot phase to mainstreaming. So at some point, I think we will have to do an assessment of these activities and do an evaluation. And in fact, if you go on our website, we have a list of about 15 potential topics we could investigate over the next 3 to 5 years. And the IMF's role on these structural issues is indeed one of the things on that list. So I think it's a good time to evaluate it perhaps in the next few years. And then on the CSOs, again, I think you're right that there has been increasing openness to bringing in the CSOs. I have heard the kind of reaction you have that even though they are coming in through the door, their input is not always sought at critical moments when the papers are being written, when the first drafts are circulated. I think there has been some change on certain papers that are considered very critical for CSOs. There has been an attempt now to bring in a select number of CSOs and give them the early drafts of papers and invite their comments. It's not being done as a general policy, but on a case-by-case basis. So there is a recognition that we can't just say we invite you to the annual meetings and we let you in the door, but whether we are really critically allowing CSO input. So I think there has been some change, but again, you're right that the IEO has not really evaluated all this, other than perhaps tangentially in some evaluation. I don't know if Charles has.
I agree with Prakash. I mean, one good example of the IMF really reaching out to CSOs is in the work on social protection, which we've been talking about. I mentioned that the fund is now embarking on a follow-up report to develop an institutional view of what should be the IMF's policy on social protection. And a very serious first step in that is going to be to reach out to civil society to hear different views. Now, civil society is a very, very wide, very diverse group. So I'm not sure that the fund is going to be able to reach everybody in civil society, but that's certainly making an effort to reach out as part of the contribution to that process. I should also say that from the IO's perspective, it's very important for us to reach out to civil society and to hear views and hear suggestions. I mean, it's part of the reason why we're here today is having a conversation so we can hear suggestions. We've heard lots of good suggestions. We typically participate in the civil society seminars at the spring meetings, at the annual meetings, where it's a great opportunity for us to present the work that we've been doing. So since I've arrived at the IO, we've been, I think, quite active in presenting seminars, both in the meetings in Washington, but also when we're traveling, because it's very important to us that we have a good relationship. How do we evaluate our colleagues? No, it's a good question. I mean, for me, I worked on IMF staff for many years, but I also left the IMF 8 years ago, and I went to work at U.S. Treasury, and the U.S. Treasury is an important shareholder of the IMF. But it was at a time when the U.S. Treasury, I think, played actually quite a a forward-leaning role, which is one of the reasons why I was attracted to go work there. This was the time with President Obama, Secretary Tim Geithner, grappling with the global financial crisis. And I think one of the things that they realized very quickly was the importance of extending beyond solutions that involve just the inner core, the G7, but the solutions needed to be global solutions where you had commitment and ownership from the emerging markets too. And I was happy to be part of those efforts at the time. And unfortunately, those efforts have not gone smoothly in recent years, so it's been a bit disappointing. But nevertheless, I think the trend has started, and the shift to a powerful G20 linked to a leaders process, not just a finance minister process, has been a crucial change. I don't think that it's fully been taken advantage of yet, but it's coming. So, but maybe I'm avoiding the question here, but let me get back to the question. So I went to work at U.S. Treasury. I then went to work at the Institute of International Finance, which is a private sector organization. And I think working in Treasury and the IIF gave me good perspective on the fund, which you don't get when you're in the fund staff. You can see the strengths of the fund, but you can also see the weaknesses. And I think I was selected for this role by the executive board. It was a vigorous process, and I think the board chose me because they could see that perhaps I brought a dual perspective. I understood the fund from the inside, but I could also see the fund from the outside in a more critical light. So I hope that I will be able to make the tough calls as they come, and the IO staff itself is a diverse mixture. Some people who worked on the IMF staff. Prakash was in the IMF research department, did a lot of actually really important work on inequality and growth that you may be aware of. But Prakash is someone who I felt had a good balanced view. He wasn't a partisan, well, the IMF is always right type of approach, but more as a research. Let's look at the evidence. Let's balance. But then also we have people from the outside, people who haven't worked on IMF staff. We also hire a lot of consultants. So when we're doing a financial surveillance evaluation now, for that we're doing many case studies, and we're hiring people from the regions to do those case studies. So if we're drifting to be too protective of the staff, then those consultants will challenge us. So there, we are, I think, always very aware of the need to get a balance right, of being understanding of the fund, but also critical of the fund, trying therefore to be effective in moving the fund forward.
Excellent. We still have about 5 minutes, so I would like to give you the last to say, and then before I conclude, if you have any additional question, go ahead. Maybe I'll just give him another minute to respond.
Okay, thank you, Pak Darno. I think I would like to address 3 points that I think quite relevant regarding our suggestion on the topics that we can suggest. First is, as you know, there's a quite fast transformations in terms of financing government deficits. So in terms of loan, we have moved from bilateral loans to the government's debt, and currently around, as I said before, 90% of government debt are tradables, and the dominations of foreigners on the structure of debt is increasing. So I think without kind of a sound governance with the complicated the debt instrument itself, it will be a problem later on. And then the second point, also regarding the loans, actually there's also another shift from bilateral loan to multilateral loans. So currently around 50% of foreign loans is dominated by multilateral agencies, and 30% from more than 30% by the World Banks, and the rest by the IDB. So with that kind of structures, I'm sure there will be a lot of sharing of common interests between the IMF and the World Bank, as we discussed before in terms of social security and so on. So I think that will be another issue, that how the growings on the multilateral loans in relation with the IMF and other agency in Indonesia, because I believe that the share of multilateral loan will increasing. And finally, my comments, there's a lot of changing in the structures of financial in Indonesia. We not only have Bank Indonesia, Indonesian Central Bank, but also the authority services agency, OJK. So how to manage the two agencies to become more synergies in doing coordinations, in coordinating, especially with the more complicated financial technologies, and how the two agencies can work together in that area. There will be another issue that may rise in the currently and also in the future. So I think that's the point that I'm thinking.
Thank you, Pak Mark. Maybe if you have a quick response to Mark's comment.
Just to say that the debt issues are very important. There are a number of countries that have built up their debts rapidly in recent years. That's raised a lot of concern, both inside the fund and outside the fund. The fund does have quite an elaborate, sophisticated framework for analyzing debt sustainability, but there are question marks about whether that framework is sufficiently recognizes different sorts of debt, whether the fund has given good advice to countries, whether the fund's advice has been effective, particularly in the context of programs where the fund typically will set a ceiling on debt. So this is an important issue, and it's one that we may well be doing a full-scale evaluation in the near future.
And on your sort of second point, I think Charles mentioned that we have two ongoing evaluations, one on financial surveillance and the other one, which I am leading, on unconventional monetary policies. I think in both those evaluations, coming from different angles, we will be looking at the relationship between the central bank and the financial regulators. So in my evaluation, for instance, we are looking at what the role should be of central banks in financial stability concerns, the role of macroprudential policies versus monetary policies. So we will be looking at that. It's an issue not just in Indonesia, but very broadly in Canada, for instance. As you know, there's any place where there has been a bit of an asset price boom, they are dealing with issues of how to manage these booms and what the role of the central bank should be. So I think we will be talking a little bit about that.
All right. I think we all agree this has been a very productive day for everyone attending to this workshop. I'm very grateful. On behalf, I'm not going to make any conclusion. I think we learn a lot from Charles, Prakash, Pak Mike, and also Pak Bambang, both on the future of IMF Independent Evaluation Office. Not IMF actually, the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, what they're planning to do, and also I think even Pak Bambang himself just realized that the existence of the EIO. So we have something in common, because both SMERU and Independent Evaluation Office grew out of crisis in 1997. So I would also to say the same thing as every time the bank come to SMERU, that it's a pity to have a crisis, to have an institution like EIO and also SMERU, because otherwise there is no independent evaluation of the IMF. Everything IMF did is always right. Now we have an independent evaluation office, so we know more rigorously about what they have been doing, what they have been engaged in countries all over the world, including your critics. I think it's fair, but I think they are adjusting the new realities, that they also would like to engage more with the civil society, not only just for the lip service, but also genuinely would like to get in touch very seriously. How did I know that? Because I was the discussant in September in Hangzhou, and I really appreciated their very high quality papers that they produce in terms of their limited role, their limited capacity when it comes to social protection. They rely a lot on the World Bank, on the technicality, and they can help on the bigger picture about financial consequences. That's the type of evaluation they would like to hear, that not everything IMF can solve the world, but they have to work together. I think also that the response from Pak Bambang Brojo in terms of how can they collaborate with the sister organization. But to be fair, the Javier is here, but this come from your own colleague from the World Bank in Washington D.C. I don't know, to be fair, the quality of work of the IMF on inequality is better than the bank. It was coming from Martin Ravalion, but he left the bank anyway. So it's good that you engage with Charles and also the IMF guys, because they are doing it very seriously. They learn something new and they would like to do it better every time. So again, on behalf of the SMERU Research Institute, I would like to thank you so much, Prakash and Charles. And this is not the first. I hope that we will have more engagement in the future. And also, Pak Mark, thank you so much for your excellent comment. But don't worry, I don't want you to say forgive but not forgive. I think that's a different story. These are nice people, and they are not beating up on us. I think the Pak Bambang Brojo, I disagree with him. His staff is here, his deputy is here, about doing this counterfactual impact evaluation. Again, that we cannot randomize countries. What happened? It's done. It's done. I didn't think we can mimic that. Like using a counterfactual agreement about those who have Indonesia look like had the IMF did not get involved at all. And you cannot compare with Malaysia. It's a different storyline. They have a lot of reserve and it's very different setup. It's a complication of political crisis, El Nino, it's everything. I'm not a friend of communist, but I'm a scholar, but I would like to be more independent in this storyline. Okay, I would like to thank Pak Asep for his support to organize. Let's give a applause to Pak Asep for his support. But most importantly is Ibu Nuning Ahmadi, our champion. This cannot happen without her and her team. She has many team. I cannot mention one by one, but thank you so much. I think this has been very productive. This is again, Prakash, you can communicate with Nuning afterward if you would like to have another, event. Not only organize, we are not event organizer, we are research institute. But if you would like to join our effort, we are very, very grateful. Let's again to give a big applause to our colleague from IMF and also Pak Mark. Thank you very much. We have a lunch on the 7th floor. It's a very nice nasi liwet Indonesian cuisine. Ya, gitu Pak. Mungkin dari saya. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih Pak Darno. Ibu Bapak sekalian, kita bisa naik ke atas lewat lift atau lewat tangga. Di sini lebih cepat.